At 48 years old, Madeline Rhodes wasn't just a guest checking into a hotel. She was the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing luxury hospitality brands in the country. But on a quiet Thursday evening in Kansas City, even her own lobby didn't recognize her. And what happened next wasn't just about a room, it was about everything. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the polished glass doors of the Wyndham Crest. Streetlights blinked to life, and the soft hum of evening traffic rolled down Grand Avenue. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the soft clinking of wine glasses and the occasional sound of luggage wheels gliding across tile. It was the kind of setting built to impress. Custom lighting, hand-carved molding, and a concierge desk framed in brushed brass. And then she walked in. Madeline Rhodes, 5'7", elegant but understated, stepped through the rotating glass doors with a quiet confidence that turned no heads. No assistant trailed behind her. No designer luggage screamed money. She wore soft brown loafers, charcoal slacks, and a muted silk blouse in dusty rose. A canvas duffel hung over her shoulder, well-worn but sturdy. Her textured hair was pulled into a neat puff, her makeup minimal. She looked, to most, like a traveler passing through. And that's exactly what the front desk saw. Behind the counter, a young woman, early 20s, long acrylic nails clacking against her keyboard, glanced up. She wore the uniform well, crisp blazer, name tag tilted slightly, Kayla. Her smile was polite, but routine, the kind of smile people give when they've already decided what you are. "Evening, checking in?" she asked, chewing on the tip of her pen. "Yes," Madeline replied, voice calm, warm. "Under Rhodes. Madeline." Kayla's fingers flew over the keyboard. Click, click, pause. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm not seeing any reservation under that name." Madeline nodded, unfazed. "That's all right. There should be a suite held open under the ownership block." Kayla blinked. Her smile faded just slightly. "Ma'am, we're actually at full capacity tonight. You'd need to have a confirmed reservation. We're only accepting registered guests." Madeline's gaze shifted, not with irritation, but awareness. Her eyes flicked just once past Kayla to the gold plaque mounted on the wall behind her. The Wyndham Crest, a Rhodes property. Her name wasn't just in the system, it was on the building. "I am a guest," Madeline said, still soft, still composed. "And more than that, I own this hotel." For a split second, Kayla didn't react. Then a slight scoff, quiet but unmistakable. "You own the Wyndham?" she asked, skeptical, leaning slightly on the desk. Madeline nodded. "I'm going to have to call the manager," Kayla said, already reaching for the phone. "Go ahead." Across the lobby, a couple in golf polos glanced over. A man near the fireplace looked up from his tablet. The shift had begun. That subtle, suffocating tension that follows black excellence when it walks into a space where no one expects it. A few moments later, a thin man appeared from a side hallway, clipboard in hand, tie crooked. His name tag read Assistant Manager, Neil Dorrance. His smile was stretched too wide. "Good evening," he began. "Is there a problem with your reservation?" "She says she owns the hotel," Kayla said a little too loudly. "I don't say it," Madeline corrected gently. "I do. My name is Madeline Rhodes. You'll find it on every quarterly report and corporate filing. I'm here for one night. There should be a suite held under the ownership block." Neil adjusted his glasses, already flustered. "Right. Just give me one moment, please." He turned toward the back, whispering into a walkie-talkie, voice low and clipped. And that's when they arrived. Security. 2 officers, one stationed near the elevators, another by the coffee bar. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, just in case. Madeline didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. But inside, she could feel it. That slow, quiet fire that builds when you've been here before. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. And that, perhaps, was the worst part of all. She could have pulled out her government ID, her business card, photos from the ribbon cutting 5 years ago. She could have shown them press clippings, magazine covers, keynote invitations. But instead, she stepped back, pulled out her phone, and made one call. Not angry, not rattled, just resolute. "I'm standing in the lobby of the Wyndham Crest," she said into the phone. "I've been denied access to my own property. Please resolve this immediately." It took exactly 26 seconds. She ended the call, slid the phone back into her coat pocket, and waited. Not pacing, not performing, just standing near a marble column while the clock ticked and the staff behind the counter fumbled between disbelief and damage control. One call. That's all it took to turn the tide. But what it revealed was far deeper than any reservation. Because this wasn't about a suite, it was about something that still hadn't changed. No matter how many hotels bore her name, she didn't wear status, she wore intention. That's what Madeline Rhodes had always believed. But as she stood in the marble column lobby of her own hotel, watching a 20-something receptionist scroll half-heartedly through the system, it became painfully clear. Her presence wasn't enough. Not tonight, not in those loafers, not with that canvas duffel slung over her shoulder like she was checking in after a red-eye, not running a multi-million-dollar brand. Kayla, the front desk agent, still hadn't looked her in the eye since placing the call to the assistant manager. Her nails clicked anxiously against the keyboard, but her face remained fixed in mild disinterest, as if Madeline were just another inconvenience during a long shift. And Neil, the assistant manager, hadn't returned yet, but the message had already been delivered loud and clear. They didn't believe her, not because her name wasn't in the system, not because they'd verified anything, but because of how she looked. Madeline glanced around the lobby. People were watching now. Side eyes, hushed whispers, a man with a laptop tilted slightly upward, pretending not to listen. Two security guards stood quietly off to the sides, present but unnecessary. But that was the point, wasn't it? Her skin said, maybe. Her clothes said no. And her silence made them uneasy. She could feel it settling in, the familiar tension that crept into rooms like this, subtle but sharp. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't disruptive. But her very existence in this space, under these circumstances, was enough to make people brace. This wasn't the first time. Years ago in Milwaukee, she was 28, newly promoted to VP, walking into a hotel in a suit 2 sizes too big because it was all she could afford. Security followed her from the front door to the elevator, only to back off when the CFO came down and greeted her by name. She hadn't forgotten that day. She never would. Now, 2 decades later, she owns 17 hotels across the country, from Baltimore to Phoenix. She'd spent years building a brand rooted in service, care, and dignity, especially for guests who, like her, were used to being overlooked. And still, none of it mattered when she walked through the front door without a designer bag, an entourage, or a clipboard. Because somewhere deep in the minds of people like Kayla and Neil, owner looked different. It looked older. It looked male. It looked white. The ache wasn't in the mistake. It was in the predictability of it. Madeline folded her arms loosely, not in defiance, but in reflection. She scanned the space again. The chandelier above, her choice. The tile below, imported per her specifications. The art on the walls, curated from Black artists across the Midwest. This entire place had her fingerprints on it. And yet, to them, she was nobody. That's what racial bias does. It isn't always loud or cruel. Sometimes it's a smile that turns flat, a voice that stiffens, a security presence that just happens to appear. It's the assumption that someone like her must be lying, or mistaken, or lost. She didn't match the picture in their heads, so they questioned the truth right in front of them. This wasn't just about booking protocol. This was about perception, about how deeply society trains people to tie competence and authority to certain visuals, and how quickly they dismiss those who fall outside that frame. Madeline didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She simply waited, composed, grounded, but far from passive. Because this moment wasn't new, and sadly it wasn't rare. It was just hers again. Madeline didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand anything. She didn't pull out a business card or flash credentials. She didn't need to. She simply stepped back, positioned herself near a marble pillar just a few feet from the front desk, and pulled out her phone. The call she made lasted exactly 26 seconds. Her tone didn't shift. She didn't rush her words or list her titles. She didn't mention the humiliating exchange, the doubting looks, the silent security guards now stationed near the elevators. She just said one thing. "I'm standing in the lobby of the Wyndham Crest in Kansas City. I've been denied access to my own property. I need this resolved immediately." Then she hung up. She didn't look at Kayla or Neil, who had returned by now, face tight with unease. She didn't scan the lobby for witnesses. She didn't record anything or post on social media. She just stood there, still, centered, and steady. A woman who had weathered enough storms to know the room always shifts eventually. And it did. First came the flicker of uncertainty in Neil's eyes as his earpiece buzzed. Then a glance toward the front desk. Then the receptionist checking her phone under the counter, pretending not to, but Madeline could see her screen was glowing with a Google search, probably searching her name, probably expecting nothing. It would have been almost funny if it weren't so familiar. That scramble to verify someone who doesn't fit the mold. That delayed respect, only granted when credentials are forced into view. But power like Madeline's doesn't need to prove itself. It just needs a moment. Because just as quickly as the tension had built, the atmosphere started to bend. The elevator dinged. Two men in business attire stepped out, one in a tailored gray suit, the other in a branded fleece vest, both moving quickly and with purpose. They weren't part of the hotel's day-to-day team. Madeline recognized them instantly. Brent Kessler, Regional Vice President, Carlos Reno, District Manager. Both had worked under her brand for years. Brent didn't waste a second. He crossed the lobby with the kind of speed that said, "We messed up, and I know it." "Miss Rhodes," he said, his voice tight but deferential, "we are so sorry. I just got the call. This is being handled immediately." Carlos followed, breathless. "Your suite is being prepared as we speak. We're rerouting your driver for the morning. Your usual espresso and fruit tray will be delivered at 7 o'clock sharp." Madeline offered the faintest nod, not because she needed them to grovel, but because she needed them to understand. She had been calm but not silent, graceful but not weak. Behind her, the receptionist's expression changed, wide-eyed, pale. Kayla had realized too late that she'd just told the owner of the building to come back with a reservation, and now the room knew it too. Security shifted their stance. The whispers in the lobby dulled. The tension that had wrapped around Madeline like static had unspooled, and now wrapped around the staff. This wasn't revenge. This was reality resetting itself. Power doesn't have to be loud to be undeniable. And Madeline had just reminded everyone of that, without ever raising her voice. Brent didn't let Neil get a word in. As the assistant manager opened his mouth to explain, probably to spin, justify, or deflect, Brent shut it down with a sharp look and a firm nod toward the back office. Neil swallowed hard and stepped aside, clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. Carlos was already tapping furiously on his tablet, pulling up Madeline's suite assignment, checking internal logs, issuing live updates. The whole lobby felt like it had been turned inside out. Moments ago, Madeline was treated like a problem. Now, she was the priority, But she didn't gloat. She didn't pace or fold her arms with satisfaction. She simply watched, with the same quiet focus she'd had since walking in. As the staff scrambled to recover from a mistake they hadn't even realized they made until it was too late. Kayla, still standing behind the counter, looked like she might disappear behind the monitor. Her fingers fidgeted with the pen she'd earlier been chewing. Her eyes darted between Brent, Carlos, and Madeline, unsure where to look, unsure what to say. The confidence she'd had 10 minutes ago had evaporated, because this wasn't just a correction, this was a reckoning. Carlos cleared his throat as he stepped forward. "Suite 1202 is ready now, Miss Rhodes," he said, the words crisp, professional. "Housekeeping's just confirmed final inspection. We've also notified your driver of a flexible pickup window in the morning. Espresso machine is stocked with your regular pods. Fruit tray's on its way up." Madeline gave a single nod. "Thank you." She didn't have to say more. The shift had already happened. The front desk, once cold and transactional, now stood silent and shaken. The whispers from guests had ceased. Even the doorman at the entrance adjusted his posture. Brent leaned in, lowering his voice slightly. "We've issued a site-wide alert. All current staff will be required to go through immediate recertification in guest protocol. The corporate audit team is on standby, and disciplinary reviews will begin tonight." Madeline's gaze moved slowly across the lobby, then back to Kayla, whose acrylic nails were now nervously tapping against the desk. This time without rhythm, without control. Her posture said everything. "I didn't know. I didn't expect this." And that, Madeline knew too well, was part of the problem. You shouldn't need to expect power to respect it. Brent followed her eyes. "We'll speak to her privately, with HR present." "I'll speak to her too," Madeline said, her voice firm but even. "Not now. After I've rested." "Of course." Carlos looked like he had more to add, but he paused when Madeline raised one hand, a quiet signal that her patience had its own language. She walked slowly to the front desk and placed her phone gently on the counter. "I'll take the 12th floor suite. Same setup. Please send someone up to confirm it's clean." Kayla opened her mouth, but no words came. Madeline didn't wait. She turned to Brent. "Have I been checked in?" He nodded, flipping his clipboard. "2 key cards. Incident report will be sent to your suite. You'll have it by the time you get off the elevator." "Good," she said, then paused. "And the rest?" Carlos stepped forward. "Memo's being drafted now. Inclusivity retraining will be mandated across all Rhodes hospitality properties. No exceptions." Madeline looked at him directly. "Make sure it's not a box to check. I want understanding, not performance." Brent nodded. "We'll make it real." Because now they knew. This wasn't just a guest complaint. It was a corporate failure, and she was the CEO correcting it in real time. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that let reflection settle in. As the doors slid shut, Madeline caught one last glimpse of Neil standing rigid near the front desk, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. Kayla still hadn't moved, but that wasn't what lingered. What stayed with her was how predictable it all had been. In a perfect world, tonight would have shocked her. Instead, it felt like a rerun. She stepped into the suite. A soft lemon and eucalyptus scent met her as she entered. Everything was in order. Espresso pods lined up neatly beside the machine, a fresh fruit tray on the sideboard, bottled water chilled in a stainless steel bucket. Someone had even left a handwritten note with her initials, MR. But Madeline didn't move to unpack right away. She stood in the center of the room, letting her eyes scan the layout. Every fixture, every finish, every choice had her fingerprints on it. And still, she'd had to fight her way into the very space she created. That was the ache, not the confrontation, but the fact that it had unfolded exactly the way she'd feared it might. She walked slowly toward the window. Below, Grant Avenue shimmered with traffic and streetlights. A freight train's horn moaned in the industrial zone, distant but steady. She could see the whole stretch of city from up here, but in her mind she wasn't here. She was back in Milwaukee. 20 years ago, different hotel, different version of herself. 28, recently promoted, still paying off student loans. The heels she wore back then had blistered her feet, and the gray blazer she bought from a clearance rack didn't fit right. She'd walked into that lobby with excitement in her chest and a briefcase full of ideas. Security had followed her the moment she stepped inside. She remembered the heat rising in her face as they shadowed her across the lobby. How one had casually asked, "Can I help you find the restaurant?" She'd tried to brush it off, tried to focus, but that moment had stayed with her, because no one else had to prove they belonged before they were allowed to sit down. The only thing that spared her that day was the CFO coming downstairs to greet her. "Madeline, there you are." That single moment of validation was the only thing that got them to back off. And here she was now, 2 decades, 17 properties, and one nationally recognized brand later. Still waiting for someone to recognize the ground she walked on was built by her own hands. She didn't want pity. She didn't even want an apology. What she wanted was a world where a woman like her could walk into a space she owned without having to explain herself. Where success didn't need to be packaged in a tailored suit or flanked by an entourage or delivered with a raised voice. Where Black women weren't constantly required to outperform their surroundings just to be seen. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from her assistant. "Everything's in motion. Let me know if you want a media statement." Madeline stared at the screen for a long second. She could have made this public. One tweet, one interview, and the story would have gone viral. But she didn't want noise. Not tonight. This wasn't about exposure. It was about exposure fatigue. About how exhausting it was to carry your worth like a shield everywhere you went. About how many times a person could be dismissed, doubted and diminished, and still choose grace. She set the phone down. Not everything needed to be broadcast to have impact. Sometimes the most powerful change began with a quiet decision not to accept the unacceptable ever again. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Madeline Rhodes stepped out of the elevator, not as a guest but as the CEO. Her charcoal gray suit was crisp, tailored to perfection. The ivory blouse underneath brought a soft contrast, understated but sharp. She wore modest black heels, not high, but enough to make each step echo clearly across the lobby's polished floor. The early morning staff was just starting to move. Coffee carts wheeled into place, guests trickling in with rolling bags, soft chatter from the corner cafe. But when Madeline appeared, everything paused. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Even the barista stopped mid-pour. Brent and Carlos were already waiting near the fireplace, 3 manila folders in hand and 2 untouched cups of coffee sitting on the table beside them. They both looked like they hadn't slept. Madeline gave a single nod and walked past the concierge desk toward the small executive conference room tucked just behind it. The door closed with a gentle click. Inside, the room was still. Seated at the table were assistant manager Neil, receptionist Kayla, and a third person, a woman from HR who introduced herself only as Marta, a corporate rep. Her notepad was already open, pen in hand. No one else said a word. Madeline didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, arms lightly folded, and looked at them all, not with disdain, not with vengeance, but with expectation. "Would someone like to explain," she asked calmly, "what happened last night from your perspective?" Kayla immediately dropped her eyes. Neil cleared his throat but produced nothing. Madeline waited. Finally, Kayla spoke, her voice just above a whisper. I didn't think she was..." She paused, stumbling. "I didn't expect..." Madeline finished it for her. "You didn't expect someone like me to own the building." Kayla nodded barely. "Was I rude to you?" Madeline asked. Kayla shook her head. "No, ma'am." Did I raise my voice? No. Did I threaten anyone? No. Madeline let the silence settle in again, not as punishment, but as a mirror. I don't need this to be a firing squad, she said, turning slightly toward Marta. But I do need accountability. Marta nodded. Understood. Carlos spoke next. We're prepared to remove Kayla from front desk rotation until retraining is complete. Neil will be placed on administrative review pending further interviews. Madeline gave a short nod and looked directly at Kayla. How long have you worked here? 4 months. And in that time, how often have you thought about who built this hotel? Who designed it? Whose name is on the paperwork? Kayla hesitated. I guess I just assumed it was some corporation. Or like a board. Madeline's tone never shifted. Do you know how many properties I've built across this country? Kayla shook her head again. 17, Madeline said. From Baltimore to Phoenix. Every one of them designed with care, intention, and pride. Luxury that's accessible. Service that's human. I didn't build these places so I could be mistaken for a trespasser. I built them so people like you could grow inside of them. The room was heavy now, not angry, not volatile, just real. Carlos broke the silence. We've already drafted a staff-wide memo, mandatory inclusivity training across all Rhodes hospitality properties, effective immediately. Make sure it means something, Madeline said. Don't give them scripts. Give them perspective. I want people to know what respect looks like when they think no one's watching. Brent added, we'll make it real. And Madeline finally sat. Because this wasn't about her ego. It wasn't about someone being rude or forgetting her name. It was about a culture that needed fixing, and the choice to rebuild it from the inside. Madeline waited until the morning rush had passed, not because she needed silence for effect, but because she didn't want distractions. No phones ringing, no carts rolling past, no artificial smiles being forced for passing guests. What she needed now was clarity, and that required stillness. She didn't send for Kayla. She didn't call HR to summon anyone. Instead, she walked herself to the staff lounge tucked behind the cafe bar, where employees usually took their 10-minute breaks and scarfed down half-cold muffins between shifts. Kayla was sitting alone. She looked up instantly, startled. Her half-eaten blueberry muffin sat forgotten on a paper napkin. Her phone was flipped face down, unopened, and her posture straightened so fast it nearly knocked over her coffee cup. Madeline raised a hand gently. Relax, she said, pulling out the chair across from her. I just want to talk. Kayla swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. Drop the ma'am, Madeline said softly. This isn't a hearing. Kayla nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. For a moment, they sat in silence. Just the hum of the fridge in the corner and the low overhead buzz of tired fluorescent lighting filled the space between them. Then Madeline asked, her voice calm, Have you ever worked in a place where you felt small? Kayla blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, she said slowly. Most of the time, actually. Tell me. Kayla hesitated, then shrugged, like she wasn't sure if it mattered. But then she spoke. I worked at this diner off I-70, wore a paper hat, got yelled at by the cooks every shift. Customers barely tipped. Some called me kid, even though I was 27. I felt invisible most days. Madeline nodded slowly. So you know what that feels like, to be unseen? Kayla's eyes lifted slightly. Yes. Then help me understand, Madeline said, voice still low and steady. How you looked me in the eye last night and decided I didn't belong here. The silence that followed was thick, not uncomfortable, just full of guilt, realization, weight. Kayla's voice cracked just a little. I don't know. I didn't mean to. When you walked in, I thought you were maybe lost or waiting on someone. You didn't look like... She stopped herself. Madeline didn't flinch. Didn't look like what? Kayla's mouth opened, then closed again. She shook her head, like the kind of person who owns a hotel. And there it was, the picture, the image so many carried in their heads of what authority looked like, what ownership looked like, what success wore and sounded like. Madeline leaned back, not coldly, but with the presence of someone who's had this conversation too many times in her life. That's the problem, she said. People have a picture, and when someone doesn't match it, they get questioned, or doubted, or worse, dismissed. I'm sorry, Kayla whispered. I know that's not enough, but I really am. I believe you, Madeline said, but I didn't come here for an apology. I came here so you could see me, not just as your boss, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a person. Kayla looked stunned. You really started as a receptionist? In St. Paul, Madeline nodded. My first manager told me I sounded too educated to be on the phones and moved me to night audit. That was the beginning. Kayla almost laughed. That's unreal. It shouldn't be, Madeline replied. It should be normal. She stood, slow and deliberate. I don't expect you to be perfect, Kayla, but I do expect you to be aware. Every guest who walks through that door, young, old, polished, plain, deserves dignity. Start there, and you'll never have to recover from a moment like last night again. Kayla stood too. Thank you for talking to me. I mean it. Madeline nodded once, then turned and walked back through the staff lounge door. She didn't need validation, but for the first time in 24 hours, she felt lighter, because the message had finally landed where it needed to. By mid-morning, the Wyndham Crest had returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Guests wheeled their bags across polished tile, espresso machines hissed behind the cafe counter, and the concierge smiled through routine questions about zoo passes and parking validation. But behind the scenes, everything had changed. Inside the management office, Brent stood by the window, watching as the valet team rotated cars in front of the main entrance. Carlos sat at a desk, finalizing the staff-wide inclusivity memo. Marta, the HR lead, reviewed new onboarding protocols with quiet intensity. And at the center of it all, Madeline Rhodes sifted through a small stack of personnel evaluations. She wasn't angry, she was focused. I'm not here to punish, she said aloud, eyes still scanning. I'm here to prevent repetition. Carlos looked up from his laptop. We've added empathy screening to the front desk interview process. Bias assessment too. Madeline tapped her pen once. Good, and put me on the site, visit rotation. Starting next quarter. Brent turned. You want to go undercover? Not undercover, Madeline replied. Just anonymous. Until I'm not. Carlos gave a small grin. That'll make some people nervous. Good, she said. Let them sit in it. She gathered the papers and stood. Launch the new training by Friday. Include real stories. Let staff read what people actually experience. Not scripts. Human words, not hollow ones. They nodded, because when Madeline Rhodes gave direction, it wasn't a suggestion, it was an expectation, rooted in purpose. She stepped back into the lobby, now calm again. At the front desk, a new receptionist looked up and smiled. Immediate, respectful, present. She nodded back. The shift had begun. Not loud, not flashy, but real. Back upstairs, her suite was tidy, bag zipped, laptop closed. Housekeeping had come and gone, but on the nightstand, something waited. A folded note. Miss Rhodes, thank you for your grace. I'll be better. Tamrayla. It wasn't typed. It wasn't branded. Just lined notepad paper and careful handwriting. And it meant more than any corporate apology ever could. Downstairs, the doorman opened her car door with warmth. Safe travels, Miss Rhodes. We hope to see you again soon. She smiled. You will. Because dignity doesn't require applause. It requires conviction. And sometimes the most powerful message is simply refusing to disappear.